There was a time when being middle class didn't feel fragile, when families didn't constantly worry that one medical bill, one layoff, or one bad month could knock everything over. They weren't rich. They didn't live extravagantly. But they slept well. And that calm came from a rule so ordinary it barely sounded like a strategy, yet it quietly shaped decades of stability. They lived below their means, not temporarily, not as a phase, as a permanent way of life. In the middle of the 20th century, most middle-class families made decisions based not on what they could afford on paper, but on what they could sustain in real life. A household might earn enough to buy a larger home, a newer car, or a more impressive lifestyle, but they often chose not to. They anchored their spending to one income even when two were available. They left margin, space, room to breathe. That margin was the forgotten rule. It wasn't about deprivation, it was about control. Bills were paid early. Savings were automatic. Purchases were delayed, sometimes indefinitely. If something broke, it was repaired. If a paycheck disappeared, life didn't immediately unravel. This wasn't accidental discipline. It was cultural. Debt existed, but it was treated with caution. A mortgage was acceptable because it produced shelter and stability. Everything else was suspect. Credit cards were not extensions of income. They were tools, used sparingly and paid off quickly. Interest was understood as a tax on impatience, not a convenience fee. Middle-class wealth grew slowly, almost invisibly. It showed up in paid-off homes, modest retirement accounts, and the absence of panic. Families didn't talk about financial freedom. They practiced it quietly. The rule worked because it protected them from lifestyle inflation, the silent force that convinces people to spend more every time they earn more. As incomes rose, expenses stayed stubbornly restrained. Raises went to savings. Bonuses went to debt elimination. The goal wasn't to look wealthier. It was to become safer. This created something modern households rarely experience: resilience. When the economy dipped, these families tightened slightly, not catastrophically. When interest rates rose, they noticed, but didn't break. Their financial lives weren't optimized for maximum consumption. They were built for survival first, progress second. And over time, that restraint compounded. Not dramatically, reliably. The forgotten rule didn't make headlines. It didn't promise speed, but it created a class of people who owned their time, their choices, and their futures long before those words became hashtags. The rule also reshaped how families thought about success. Status wasn't measured by how much you spent, but by how little you owed. Owning things outright carried weight. A car with no payment. A home inching closer to being paid off. Savings that weren't touched unless something truly mattered. This mindset insulated families from comparison. They didn't need to keep up because they weren't racing anyone. Their financial decisions weren't reactive. They were deliberate, and that deliberateness was powerful. Children grew up watching money handled calmly. They saw parents plan purchases weeks or months in advance. They learned that "we can afford it" didn't always mean "we will buy it." That lesson alone shaped an entirely different relationship with money, one rooted in patience instead of pressure. Middle-class families also understood that wealth wasn't just about income, it was about predictability. A smaller house with stable payments beat a larger one with stress attached. A reliable used car beat a flashy new one with a long loan. Stability was the asset. This rule mattered most during transitions. Job changes, illness, economic downturns. Because expenses were kept intentionally low, flexibility stayed high. Families could absorb shocks without scrambling. They didn't need perfect conditions to stay afloat. Modern systems quietly discourage this behavior. Advertising celebrates upgrading. Credit smooths over consequences. Monthly payments disguise real cost. But older families saw cost clearly in hours worked, stress carried, and options lost. They also respected time. A purchase wasn't just money spent. It was future labor committed. That awareness created friction, and friction prevented mistakes. Buying something expensive required justification beyond desire. It had to earn its place. The rule didn't reject ambition. It simply separated ambition from consumption. Progress was measured in security, not spectacle. Wealth meant fewer obligations, not more. As years passed, something subtle happened. Families who lived this way found themselves with choices. Early retirement became possible. Helping children without sacrificing their own stability became realistic. Emergencies became manageable instead of devastating. This wasn't luck. It was design. The forgotten rule worked because it aligned spending with values instead of impulses. It treated money as a tool for protection first, growth second, enjoyment third, in that order. And while the world sped up, this rule slowed life down, just enough to keep it from spinning out of control. Eventually, the rule produced something modern culture struggles to replicate: quiet confidence. These families didn't feel behind. They weren't constantly chasing. They knew where they stood, and that knowledge brought peace. Their wealth wasn't always obvious, but it was real. It lived in paid-off obligations, in savings accounts that didn't fluctuate with moods, in the ability to say no. They didn't need constant income growth to feel secure because their foundation was already solid. The rule also prevented a dangerous illusion that higher income automatically equals safety. Middle-class families understood that risk increases when spending rises to meet earnings. The more you need, the more fragile you become. By keeping needs intentionally modest, they reduced exposure. This created a virtuous cycle. Lower expenses meant higher savings. Higher savings meant lower stress. Lower stress led to better decisions. Better decisions reinforced stability. Over decades, that cycle quietly produced wealth. Not dramatic wealth, durable wealth. The rule didn't fail because it stopped working. It faded because it stopped being taught. As financial products became more complex and consumption more normalized, restraint lost its appeal. Margin was replaced with optimization. Security with speed, but the math never changed. A household that consistently spends less than it earns avoids unnecessary debt, and prioritizes margin will always outlast one that doesn't, regardless of income level. The rule scales. It adapts. It survives trends. That's why it kept middle-class families wealthy. Not rich in appearance, but rich in options, rich in time. Rich in stability. The forgotten rule wasn't glamorous. It didn't promise transformation. It promised continuity, the ability to keep going year after year without collapse. And in a world where financial pressure feels constant, that kind of wealth might be the rarest kind of all.